Welcome everybody back to the podcast studio here at KCGOP. We have Representative Walsh with us today and State Party Chair, and he is sharing with us some interesting things about our state constitution. Our Washington State Constitution has just a lot of unique elements in it. And so we're here today to learn a little bit more. You know, when our founders wrote our founding documents of our country, one of the things they all agreed on was to maintain the country of America is we needed to have an educated electorate. We needed to have people understand that they're the ones that run their government and what those responsibilities looked like. And so part of what we're doing today is diving into our state constitution a little bit and learning some more. So I have a question for you, sir, on from your position in Olympia as representative, what parts of the state constitution do you maybe employ the most or find the most specifically used, I guess, for that part of your job?
Sure,
you know what I'm asking. Yeah.
Sure. Well, there's a lot in the state constitution. People get sick of hearing me say it. I like the Washington State Constitution even better as a document than the federal constitution. Although the state constitution acknowledges the federal constitution as the highest law in the land, I still like our state constitution. It does a lot of things either more clearly or more completely than the federal constitution does, talking about policy, talking about law and what law should be. As a legislator, in my role as a legislator down in Olympia, I often go to the kind of middle section, well, the first third section of the state constitution. There are 32 articles. Those are like the chapters in the state constitution. There are 32 of them. A lot of the heaviest lifting and the most important stuff is kind of in the first third, like the first 10 or so of those 32 articles. Some of the later ones kind of get into the weeds on some very particular things. There's a lot of language about tidelands and certain kind of property rights that are later in the document. But the early sections of the document are the ones where I think most of the real meat is about how government should operate. I'm going to focus in this conversation about Articles 2, 3, and 4. And this is a little elementary, but it's relevant to my work as a legislator. Those are the three sections of the state constitution that deal with the three branches of government. Just as in the federal government in DC, they have three branches. Here in our state, we have three branches of government. Article 2 talks about the legislative branch, and that's the one I'm in as a legislator. Article 3 talks about the executive branch. That's the governor and the state attorney general in those statewide executive positions. And then Article 4 is the one that talks about the judicial branch, so judges and how judges are treated and how they work in Washington State. So I'll talk about each one in turn. Article 2 talks about the legislature, and it says that, rightly so, that the legislature is the maker of law. The executive, people get confused about this all the time. They think the governor or the state attorney general make law. No, the legislature makes the law. And it talks about how the legislature also makes the budgets. Again, a lot of people, when they read the paper or they get their news from the radio or TV, they think the governor makes a budget. No. Now the governor can make suggestions, and he can make a proposal, and he or she does that every couple of years. They'll make their proposal, but the legislature really does two things: make law and write the budgets for the state government. And we periodically see controversies around the budget part because we do some things in our state that aren't in the Constitution, unfortunately, about our budgets. We use a method of budget writing in Olympia called basically budget-based budgeting. And that sounds like a circle, and it is. What that means mostly is we don't rebuild the budget every 2 years. We work on a 2-year budget cycle in Olympia. So we don't rebuild the whole budget from the ground up every 2 years. We basically take the last budget and decide what we really negotiate is the additional new money we're going to spend and some changes in the budget. But we assume that the previous budget is the starting point. And what I and other people would like to see in Olympia, and this is something that the state constitution would support, would be a so-called zero-based budgeting process, where every 2 years, when we renegotiate our budgets, we start at zero. We assume nothing. We build our budgets for the state agencies, for programs from scratch every budget cycle. But we don't do that currently, and I think the state is worse for it, because I think we end up assuming a bunch of inefficiencies from the last go-round, and we don't look at those, we don't examine those and renegotiate those as we should every budget cycle. So, but the Constitution is clear. Writing the budget ultimately is the legislature's job. Now, in Article 3, it talks about the executive branch, and in Washington State, we do elect more executive officers than most states elect. Of course, most states elect the governor, of course, and most states elect the state attorney general. Some states don't go much farther than that. But in our state, we elect the governor, the lieutenant governor, the state attorney general, the commissioner of public lands, the superintendent of schools, the treasurer, the auditor, and the insurance commissioner. And I don't think I'm leaving anyone out. I think that's it. So we elect a lot of executive officers directly in our state, where in other states, some of those positions, like the insurance commissioner or the treasurer, are in the governor's cabinet, and the governor just appoints them.
Okay.
But here in Washington, when we started, over 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the founders of Washington State believed in, they were reformers, what they called reform or progressives in their day, and they thought that the people ought to elect as many executive branch officers as possible. So those are elected. Now, those executive branch officers oversee specific agencies of the state government. The governor is the catch-all. The governor oversees everything that somebody else isn't directly elected to oversee. But, for example, the state attorney general oversees that office, a whole bunch of lawyers. As the last several have said, the state attorney general of Washington is basically the CEO of the largest law firm in Washington State. They hire hundreds of lawyers, and they do many things. The commissioner of public lands, this is a position that some people don't understand very well, but should, is a independently elected commissioner, as the title says, but oversees the state's Department of Natural Resources, DNR. And that's important in Washington because that agency oversees the publicly owned timberlands in our state. And as most people watching will have at least a little knowledge of, our state has a lot of publicly owned timberland. Historically, that was a major source of money for the state government and for local governments, for counties, for school districts. In the last 10 years or so, we've kind of screwed up that great system. We've restricted the amount of timber that we harvest, the trees we cut down to use as wood products, as lumber, as whatever. And that's because the last couple of independently elected commissioners have been very restrictive. They felt that we shouldn't cut trees down in this state, which is kind of odd because the whole point of electing that position was to get like a timber person in there who knows the timber industry and manages those lands well to the benefit of, kids at school in the state. So that's independently elected. We also independently elect those other positions I talked about. The treasurer basically manages the finances of the state. The state is allowed to borrow through bonds, certain monies. The treasurer has to make sure that basically we got the best interest rate on those bonds. And from time to time, we'll refi the state's bonds the way you might refi your house if they can catch a lower interest rate. So the treasurer does that. The auditor, independently elected, is supposed to act as kind of the inspector general, checking on the efficiency of other state agencies. Lately, the auditors have been a little soft on the mark, and I think that's a position that if more people understood, they would care more about who the auditor is and want to see that auditor be a little more aggressive. Go find where money's being misspent or money's gone missing or whatever like that. And there are others too. The school superintendent, the state school superintendent, in many states that's appointed by the governor. In our state, it's independently elected, and that needs a lot of attention because our schools have been suffering, and frankly, the last couple of superintendents have not been doing a good job. The point being, all those executive positions are meant to implement the law that the legislature makes. They don't make law, they implement the law the legislature makes. They can recommend budgets, but the legislature writes the budget. And of course, the third branch of government is the judicial, the judges. And in our state, we elect our judges, but we've gotten away from some of the things that the state constitution talks about in Article 4, which is about judges. And we've gotten into this system not described by the state constitution, described by the Bar Association and other organizations. The Constitution allows for elections of judges to be direct and transparent. What's happened in the years since the Constitution was written is there have been all these traditions started where when people are running for judge in this state, they're not supposed to talk about this or that. They're not supposed to talk about political orientation. They're not supposed to talk about how they might rule on an issue if it came before them as a judge. The Constitution doesn't say any of that. Judge elections could be a little more transparent and open, but the traditions that have built up in the decades since restrict what judge candidates can say. And I get a lot of complaints about that. People want to know more. They're like, why don't these judge candidates say what they stand for?
Yeah.
And the Constitution would allow that, but it's our practices and our traditions that have built up that restrict it.
Interesting. Okay, so a question for you. What might you recommend for people who want to understand a little more about the executive branch positions? I've gone on the tour at Olympia where you walk through the different offices, and that was, very helpful to kind of understand how things move through our government there. Is there some practical ways? We can always get online, but is there, to get a better understanding of how the different departments work and how we can engage in our government a little more, effectively? Do you have some tips there?
Well, sure. It is complicated because we do elect more executive branch individuals than most states do. Each of those departments has its own website, but if you just Google to the Washington State government website, wa.gov, you can click through in their menu to each of those departments' own pages, and you can see more about what they do, and that elected individual tends to have a little picture and a short sort of value statement about what they're trying to do. The important thing to know is the reason the Constitution allows for these election of so many executive branch officers in Washington is they are supposed to be transparent and accountable to the voters. And sometimes, frankly, they've kind of hidden in the high grass of complexity and, well, it's too complicated, people can't understand that. And I always tell people, don't take that for truth at all. We're a common sense state with a common sense constitution, and if there's something you don't understand about what the insurance commissioner does, you have every right to just knock on that door or send an email and say, my insurance rates just went up. What the heck's going on? Explain this to me. And they need to serve you and answer that question.
That's good. That's really good. Okay, and a final question, maybe when you're serving, when sessions open January, February, how long is it this year? Is it the 90 days or are we the longer one?
In the odd numbered year in Olympia, there's the so-called long session, and that goes over about 4 months, it usually goes, and that's where we negotiate the 2-year budget cycles. Then in the even-numbered year, there's the so-called short session, which runs about 60 days. because we don't negotiate the budget in the short session. Well, we're not supposed to, but we end up negotiating a lot of adjustments to it. But you don't write the main 2-year budget in that cycle. And that's also, for the legislature, the election year. Elections are on even numbered years. So the session is shorter so that the session is over, hopefully like in March of that year, and then you can focus on politics and getting elected or re-elected. So the long session is in odd numbered years and the short session in even.
And tell me, how valuable is it when people call in or write in or communicate with you as a representative, when people just engage, whether they go there in person, all the different ways they can, how does that impact you as you're making decisions? I think it's just always good to hear.
Well, a lot. I mean, no single letter or email or phone call by itself will usually sway a legislator's opinion about something or position on something. But in volume, if there are a lot of communications coming in saying this tax idea is terrible, don't support it, then the aggregate, the total effect of people communicating can change a legislator's mind. So I believe in direct communication. I think it works, especially if you coordinate with other like-minded people and all of you communicate. That can change the direction of a bill or a budget item or something like that. And there is, during the legislative sessions, the greatest kind of tension among the 3 branches is definitely between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Because aggressive people, politicians elected to those executive branch positions, want to run everything. They want to say, here's how much money I need, here's the laws I want to write, and they're welcome to make those suggestions, but they don't have any constitutional authority to make it happen. That someone in the legislature has to agree and sponsor the thing that the executive branch asks for. And there's a little too much of that happening automatically. I think the legislature often needs to push back a little bit on the executive and say, no, we don't like that idea, we're not going to run that bill. And occasionally, the Speaker of the House, from the leaders in the legislature, will do that, but not enough. I would like to see a little more pushback from the legislature on those requests from the executive branch.
Okay, really good. Okay, so for those taking notes, this is Article 2, 3, and 4?
2 is the legislative, 3 is the executive, and 4 is the judicial, the judges.
Okay, perfect. All right, very great. Thank you very much for joining us today.